Hi, I'm going to show you how to make a table runner. I have already got, it's measured out and cut 19 inches by 120 inches long, plus 6 inches overhang on both sides. Now, I've already got this end all done, so you can see what it looks like on the end here. And I'm going to show you the other end. Now, I took my ruffle, serged all four ends of it, or all four sides, and I gathered it up with my machine stitch here. This is a ruffle edge that has a long and short. You have to put it in the long one so I can pull the strings. For those of you who haven't done this before, if you pull on the bottom side, one side is a little bit easier to pull than the other side, but the bottom side is always going to be easier to pull. So I've kind of ruffled that up a bit. Now you want to measure. Now I've got this measured exactly 5 inches down. It's going to hang 6 inches over, but I'm going to stitch this on right at the edge of my ruffle, right at the 5-inch mark where these pins are. So you kind of pin that in place. If you can see that, pin it in place right along where my pins are. Actually pin both sides, that way you know exactly how much to ruffle your edges here. Now if you don't have a serger to do these edges, these are pretty cool. If you can see that, a narrow hem on my serger. And if you don't have that, there is a foot that you can get that's pretty cool. It's called a curling edge foot. It has a little spiral thing here that you can zigzag, feed your fabric in there, and it zigzags over and it kind of curls the fabric as you go along. And that kind of gives you the same look. So that's pretty handy to have. Another thing you can do for nice finish is a double needle. See if I've got one here. I do. Yay. Double needle. This thing here is pretty cool. It doesn't finish the edge like this, but you can zigzag your edge and fold it under, and this will give you a nice finish. You have to have 2 spool things up here, spool holders, and you feed them both together, and then you put your double needle in. One will go on the left side, one will go on the right side, and that will give you a kind of a cover stitch to finish it off. I mean, it doesn't curl like this, but that's the second best thing. It's a pretty cool thing to have. Okay, back to my table runner here. Okay, now I'm going to pin this ruffle here right at the 5-inch mark. You kind of want to gather it, even out the gathering, so you've got it right here on the end too. It's all not, so it's not all scrunched up at one side here. You can probably do that a little bit as you go along, but make sure you. Important thing is to get a straight line. You always want to have straight lines when you're sewing. So I'm going to pin that one down 5 inches, and I'll gather that up as I go. So now I've got my stitch back on my normal 2.5 or about 2, actually between 2 and 3, yeah. So always lock your stitch in place. Pull your pins out as you go along. Don't run over them because that will break needles and mess up your timing in your sewing machine, which could cost a lot of money to fix. So, and you can go ahead and pull these other needles, pins out as you go along. Now I like to usually take something, and don't feed your finger in there. So take something. I usually like to use my seam ripper, but I broke it. So I'm using a tiny crochet hook to kind of feed that in there, keep my fingers out of the way. It helps the stitch. Get them in there just right. And if you need to, put more pins in so you guide yourself in that 5-inch mark. It's all about following the lines just right. That was a little bit crooked, so I'm going to pull that pin out. Flatten out that ruffle as you go along. Some of these are pretty heavy duty. You want to keep that fingers out of this, don't run over them. And follow your edge of your ruffle on the edge of your foot to your presser foot. It's always important to follow lines. Look at a line and keep it going straight. That'll give you a straight line. Same thing when you're cutting. Whenever you cut, look at the end of where you're going and you'll get a straight line. If you look at your hand, it's going to go crooked. So I learned that in gymnastics years ago. Always look ahead, not where your hand is going. So pull that one out. Okay, now I'm at the area where I gotta start ruffling it by hand. Still use your needle here to push that ruffle under the foot to help feed it a little bit. If you don't have that stitch, that ruffling stitch, you can use just the longest stitch you possibly have, or just go really slow and feed it through like this, but they go in one direction. It's like the pleat's always going to be folding in one direction if you do it by hand. If you do it with this ruffle foot, you're going to have them in both directions. It's not going to look like it's hand fed in there, pleated. And now I'm at the end, and I'm going to take that pin out so I don't run over it. Back stitch. Take that other pin out. Cut my loose threads. Now you can, if you use a different color thread when you're doing that ruffle stitch, you make sure you pull it out. And if it's the same colored thread, nobody's going to know. Especially in this case, because I'm turning it over. This ruffle is going to be going in the other direction. So I am folding it over like that and pressing it down. If you can see. Folding it over and pressing it down. Okay. That is the end of my table runner right there. Pretty easy. Oop, I got a little pucker right there. So if that happens, you got to get out your seam ripper. And I use a little rotary cutter for a seam ripper. And I'm just going to pull up that little section right there. Gotta be very careful because this is super sharp and you don't want to cut a hole in your fabric. If you get a little pucker like that, no biggie, just like I said, just pull that little section out and go over it. Make sure you lock in your stitch. Where was it? Okay, I started right there. I put on my little reader so I can see exactly what I'm doing. Okay. The reason I got that pucker is because my ruffle's a little bit too tight here. I'm just going back all the way across. Didn't hurt to double stitch. Just things like that. So just reinforces it. Always backspace, lock it in. Now, if you don't have the ability to backstitch or lock in your threads, there's this stuff called Freecheck. This stuff is wonderful. It's a clear glue. When you first buy it, like I just did, you have to cut the tip off and poke a pin down in there. This is what you use to lock in your threads so that they make sure. It's really hard to get it straight, as you can see. Find the middle part. There you go. And it does dry out pretty fast. I use this on all my ends. It kind of glues it so it doesn't come unraveled. So if you notice a lot of your clothes that you buy in the stores, they come unraveled really easy because they're done with a serger and there's no back stitch on a serger, so they just zoom right through and then they come unraveled. So if you use Freecheck on your clothes when you first buy them, go through your seams, then a lot of them wouldn't come unraveled. But that's all done there. Now I check my backside, smooth it out a little bit, cut those little loose threads in here. Okay, now I'm going to press it over again. And when you have a ruffle going in an opposite direction, when you turn it over like that, you kind of want to top stitch. Now, top stitching, it's going to be really thick but you need to do it, otherwise, well, you could iron it down. I don't like ironing it, or like top stitching, but it's, I think I'm going to have to do it. Let's see how it looks. But I'm going to use a thicker stitch just in case I don't like the way it looks. And you want to follow, just use the smallest stitch you possibly can. So I'm going to turn my stitch, my needle over to the left and line up the edge of your fabric, wherever the seam is, with the edge of your foot. So you've got a narrow edge. Always use your press your foot, or if you've got lines on your sewing machine, follow that as a guideline. It's really important, everything you do when you sew, to follow a straight line. Because if you don't get a straight line, then your fabric is not going to lay down right. So that's a rule when you first learn how to sew. Follow those lines. And press this down, hold it. If you want to iron it ahead of time, go ahead. I'm a little impatient tonight. I don't want to iron it down. I can just press it. Make sure you get those gatherings. You don't want them to pull as you go, though, so that's a good point to make whenever you're, to iron them down. But just press them. Sink your needle if you're going to do that. Press those feet down in your bottom section. Make sure everything is lined up and not going with your stitch flow, so it's laying down straight and not pulling towards you. That makes any sense. Go a little bit slow. Press them down. Top stitch. I usually sew pretty fast, but something like this, go slow, break a needle, and make sure you get it right. And the faster you go, in a situation like this, the more chance for mistakes. And I'm doing this for a customer, so I want to make sure I get it right. Feels like it's pulling towards you, then stop and pick it up. And when you're sewing clothes or anything you do, I used to sew everything in the same direction because I like the edge of my fabric on the inside, away on this side and not in my machine. But I learned it's like everything was pulling that way, so you have to turn them over, go in the same. You don't want everything going in the same direction because it's not going to line up right. Pinning everything is really important. Pin, pin, pin. You can't overpin things because that way your fabric is not going to pull on the bottom side. It's going to line up right. It's really important to look professional and lock your stitching. Okay. Can you see that? There you go. I'm all done. I'm going to cut my threads and use my Freecheck on them. If you've got a little knotty end there, a little fray end, don't be afraid to do that. Also, sometimes if you've got loose ends, take a lighter and be real careful of the white fabrics because this does tend to burn. Just quickly go over the edges, and that sears the edges really good. But Freecheck will kind of do the same thing, but if you've got little fuzzy edges on anything, do it really quick, and it just kind of seals it up and shrinks it back in there. So if you've got, like this one here, and if you can see that, that's kind of a fuzzy edge there. So I'm going to do that with quickly. And on this side here, same thing. Well, that's a little thick though. I'm going to cut that down first. Make sure I've got Freecheck on it. Freecheck, allow it to dry. Glue all those ends good. And that might be enough. This stuff you can get it for like $2.98 at Walmart, and it's like $3 something at Joann's. It's worth its weight in gold. You can use it for a lot of things. So, okay. Now you could shorten your ruffle. This is the picture she sent me. If you can see that, it's a little bit longer, but I like the length of this one. I don't think I want to mess with it and shorten it, so now I'm going to do the other side. I don't think you need to see this. So I'm all done. So how does that sound? 20, this was 19 inches wide by 120 inches long, and then a 6-inch overhang on both sides. So when I measured it out, I measured my 120 inches, and then I pinned it, and then I went another 6 inches, and then I pinned it on both ends. So that way I always pin and pin and pin. Measure several times before you cut to avoid mistakes. Okay. And then my ruffle here, I had taken the whole length of the fabric. Most fabrics are like 48 inches wide, so I just cut. I think it was 6 inches, 6-inch ruffle. I cut it the whole length of the fabric, and it was almost twice as long as this 19-inch, and I figured that was enough to give me a good ruffle, because you want the fabric all to be in the same grain. If you cut it from your table runner is going in one direction and your ruffle's going in another direction on your fabric, the grain of your fabric, sometimes it doesn't always look right. But this one, it worked out just fine. So, especially if you have a nap of the fabric where you have fabric, you know, threads that go like corduroy. That's a nap fabric. So velvet's the same way. So, or any kind of a print, you always want to kind of go with the same cut ruffle of the same grain of the fabric, so that your table runner is going to go in. So, if that makes sense. Okay, hope you learned something. Bye.